The ancient Persians achieved something few peoples in history ever managed. They rose from scattered tribes to forge a kingdom that felt, to outsiders, like a living legend, a place of unmatched wealth, shimmering refinement, and breathtaking order woven into every custom and law. Yet that grandeur rested on rules that could feel strange, even unsettling to modern ears, because for the people of that world purity was not a metaphor, it was a living boundary that had to be guarded every hour of the day. In that world, death did not mark an ending so much as the beginning of a process, strict and practical, guided by sacred law. Among the Zoroastrians, who were the dominant religious community before the rise of Islam, the elements were not mere materials. Earth, water, fire, and air were holy, and to pollute them was to tilt the cosmos off balance. A corpse, by definition, carried defilement, so burying a body in the soil or burning it on a pyre was seen as a crime against the order of the universe. When someone died, the body was not laid in a grave. Instead, it was carried to the top of a round stone tower known as a Tower of Silence, placed upon a flat platform, and arranged with careful separations by sex and age, men in one sector, women in another, children apart. There were no crosses, no markers, no names. Only a circle of stone and the turning sky above, while the birds did the work that the living could not allow themselves to do. Vultures, sacred in their own way, consumed the flesh, carrying away impurity so that it would not drift into the earth or sink into the rivers or leap into the temple flame. The process could be swift, a matter of hours, until bone was all that remained. Those bones, still considered dangerous to the balance of the world if handled carelessly, were dropped into a central pit to decay slowly, without burial, as rainwater seeped through and dissolved everything that tied the remains to the identity of a person. The fear was specific, almost physical, because impurity, called nasu, was thought to spread with a ruthless precision, skin to air, breath to house, house to everything it touched. Where some cultures fought uncleanness with incense or prayer, Zoroastrian law leaned on a different power, the cleansing strength of consecrated bull's urine, known as gomez. This was not metaphor, not symbol. It was a rite carried out to the letter. The dead were washed in it, and so were the living who had touched the dead. If a hand brushed a corpse, that person would be washed 3 times with the purifying liquid while sacred formulas were spoken aloud, because impurity could hear and hide, and silence would have given it cover. The bulls themselves were kept under strict regulations. They were temple herds, not beasts of burden, not for breeding, and never to be injured, living vessels of sanctity whose gift was carefully collected according to rule. Even after a body was exposed in the tower or left to unmake itself in the pit, strands of identity could cling to what seemed insignificant: hair and nail. Those too were dangerous because they endured, and anything that endured could hold on to the taint that the living order could not safely absorb. Hair from the dead was burned in a separate fire, never in the holy fire of a sanctuary. Nails, also washed in the same consecrating liquid, were set upon shards of pottery and turned to ash until nothing was left, because even a single unpurified hair falling into a temple flame could desecrate it so thoroughly that priests would be summoned to reconsecrate the hearth through a renewal lasting not less than 3 days. The warnings could be stark. If hair or nails touched water, that water could not be drunk, could not be used for bathing, could not be brought into a home. It had to be poured out onto a barren patch of earth or boiled away to vapor so that its life would not die into sickness and drought. Water in that faith was not a neutral resource. Water was a living female essence with a name and a dignity that demanded defense. If death touched a river, accidentally or by intention, the violation was grave, and it was graver still if a great river was involved, a body of water revered for its sacred strength. Then a special rite would be needed, a cleansing that could last from 3 to 9 days, with priests bearing a pure flame, ash and the same consecrating liquid to the bank, chanting formulas from the sacred law, and pouring sanctification downstream so that corruption would not creep back into the places already made whole. Sometimes the water would be drawn into vessels and purified away from the current, then returned, because the balance had to be restored without pushing ruin into the wider world. Justice in that empire stood upon the same bedrock of order. Punishment was severe but not mindless, and even law's harshest edge kept its eye on proportion. A first offense was not supposed to end in a death sentence, and a person's good deeds were to be weighed before a final judgment. Yet when guilt was proven, mercy did not mean leniency at the expense of the cosmic structure. There was a guiding principle. Do not spill blood, not even in the name of law, because blood, like water and fire, belonged to the sacred weave that held the world together. So execution avoided blades and spectacle. The condemned might be enclosed in a narrow chamber, sometimes in the earth, sometimes in stone, with no exit and, at times, a ration of food, but never water, so that life ebbed through thirst, breath, and the pressure of isolation. The purpose was not mere cruelty. The purpose was to keep the elements unstained, to let a life end without letting its last traces poison the powers that sustained creation. It was a logic that reached beyond murder to other violations, heresy, perjury, forbidden contact with the dead, or even the loss of ritual purity that demanded a term of isolation, to break the chain of defilement and return a soul to balance. The law's severity could be unforgettable. When a chief judge named Sisamnes took bribes, King Darius, who wanted his courts to stand for justice, not favor, ordered a sentence whose lesson would be impossible to ignore. After execution, the judge's skin was used to cover the chair from which he had once pronounced verdicts, and the next judge to sit upon it was his own son, a daily reminder that justice was not a posture. It was a price that had to be paid in full. Other punishments became stories that traveled far beyond the court. One of the most feared was suffocation in ash, carried out in a towering hollow cylinder filled with fine, caustic dust. The condemned would be dropped into that slow sea, not to die from the fall, but to struggle for breath as clouds of powder rose with every movement, filling the lungs grain by grain until the body could no longer pull the world inside. It was a horror that echoed into sacred writings, a warning about the fate of those whose lives had strayed too far from truth. Humiliation could be weaponized, too, and sometimes its target was an emperor. Rome learned that the hard way when Valerian, after a failed campaign, fell into the hands of the Persian king Shapur. Chains were not the worst of it. The former emperor became a living trophy, forced to march and, at times, made into a footstool for the king to mount his horse, the weight of a conqueror pressed into a back that once wore a purple cloak. When the end came, molten gold poured into a royal throat turned death into a symbol, a message that the sun had set on Rome's pride. For a time, at least. There were punishments reserved for enemies of the king, torments so rare and elaborate that they were remembered precisely because they were not common. In one such sentence, the victim was stripped and confined in a hollowed trunk or between two tight-fitting boats so that only the head, hands, and feet remained exposed. Then began a ritual of forced feeding with milk and honey until the gut failed, the body soaked itself, and flies and wasps swarmed to the sweetness on skin. Maggots and inflammation turned flesh into a living grave, while the captors continued to feed the victim day after day, stretching the boundary between life and death until the mind broke first and the body, stubbornly, followed later. Ancient accounts claim that someone once endured this torment for not less than 7 days, a detail repeated less as a record than as a shudder. Priests stood near the center of public life, and faith could shape politics in ways that left scars. There was a tale of a man named Smerdis who fooled the people into believing he was a royal son and seized the throne. For a time, he governed capably, easing taxes and softening the laws of military service, which made the truth, when it surfaced, all the more dangerous. After his death, the fury of the crowd turned upon the priestly class, and year after year, on the day of his end, the streets could become a theater of vengeance, where any cleric who showed his face risked being torn down as a symbol of betrayal that the people vowed never to forget. Rebellion met punishments crafted to terrify without granting the dignity of a quick end. When Darius crushed a rising, leaders were maimed to live as warnings, tongues cut out, one ear left, one eye spared, bodies chained at palace gates where every passerby could read the king's will upon living flesh. For weeks those broken figures absorbed insults, blows, and weather, the lesson written in pain that outlasted their voices. Society itself was a chain of obedience, the young to elders, the poor to officials, the officials to the king, and the king to the law. To break that chain was not only disobedience, it was an insult to the structure of the world. Education, service, and punishment all grew from the same root, severe and ritualized, but clear enough that no one could claim not to know the cost. Boys spent their earliest years in women's quarters, often kept from their fathers until they had survived the most fragile span of childhood, so that bonds would not be shattered by a loss too common to risk. Two virtues were honored above most for men: courage and fertility. A king might reward a father of many children with gifts, not as charity, but as recognition that he had invested in the future of the kingdom. From early on, boys were trained to ride with grace, to shoot with precision, and to speak the truth, because lies were not merely frowned upon, they were a stain upon the order that yoked the world together. Work tied people to the land in ways that were both practical and unforgiving. There were state labor settlements where bound farmers, neither slaves in the private sense nor free in any meaningful way, were moved in groups to difficult ground, salty soil, marsh borders, raw edges of canals, to toil from dawn to dusk under the eyes of officials. Women and children pulled alongside men. There was no wage, only rations, grain, oil, and worn clothes from government stores. The worst punishment was not always the lash. It could be transfer into a dead zone where the work was heavier than the food that kept a body standing. The dead were not honored with the rites of exposure because ritual purity had long since been denied to those camps. Bodies were thrown into earth or dry channels like refuse, a policy that only made sense in a world that understood impurity as a force that could be measured in breath and shadow. In Zoroastrian thought, repairing a breach in order required action, not apology. Cut away, cast out, rename. Marry into a line that could restore balance, even when the bond offended instincts that later ages would take as absolute. One of the most disturbing rites, recorded in later religious texts, described sanctioned unions between close kin under strict conditions, not as indulgence, but as a shield to preserve a lineage considered uniquely faithful, a family whose ritual correctness would yield children doubly blessed and clean. Such unions were rare and controversial even then, and they clustered in elite circles where the defense of spiritual order could outweigh the pull of common custom. A name in that culture did more than identify a person. It linked a soul to law and clan and rite. Priests spoke names to call a spirit into a ritual. Names were written into cleansing formulas, stitched into the fabric of belonging. To break the law, especially sacred law, could profane a name so deeply that it had to be erased. The state would strip a person of the old name and impose a new one, sometimes shaming, sometimes animal. Recorded in public rolls that neighbors, judges, and officials were obliged to use. Even relatives under threat of penalty had to let the former name die on their tongues, because memory itself could become a pathway for disorder to walk back into the world. At the summit of that order stood the Shah, not only a ruler, but an embodiment of the law's harmony. His body, voice, and even his shadow, belonged to a realm that ordinary eyes could not touch without risk. To look a king in the eyes without sanction was to cross a boundary, not of etiquette, but of sanctity. Those who broke that line could be destroyed without a word, not for insolence, but for trespass. Painters did not work from life. They worked from descriptions and casts. Even in death the king remained veiled, his name unspoken for days, because to gaze upon a royal face without right was to repeat the same violation that the law had spent centuries teaching the people to fear. Erasure reached beyond the person. If a traitor or blasphemer fell under a certain sentence, the archives would be scoured. Scribes struck lines, shattered inscribed vessels, and scoured stone. Houses and tombs could be leveled so that no form remained to cradle a memory. Neighbors were pressed to forget. Family was forbidden to speak. To utter a cursed name in prayer could pull punishment down upon the speaker. For a faith that tied a soul's journey across the Chinvat Bridge to the integrity of a name, this was more than politics. It was a sentence that reached past death into the fate of what endured. Blood vengeance, when it came, was not lawlessness, but law in motion. The family of the slain held the right to execute the killer or to accept compensation in cattle or silver or land, but only with the family's consent. If kin refused to pursue vengeance or justice in court, they could themselves be charged with allowing impurity to persist in the world. An oath to avenge could be sworn, recorded, and inherited, a duty that might last for decades without curdling into private feud, because in that structure it remained part of the machinery that turned the universe back toward balance. If this tale has stirred a sense of awe or unease, that response is part of its purpose. It is a journey into a civilization that took order seriously enough to anchor every custom to the health of creation, a world where purity was a living law, and the smallest act could tilt the balance toward harmony or decay. A world built on order needs guardians, and in ancient Persia, those guardians were not only soldiers or judges, but teachers, mothers, and elders who rehearsed the laws of balance in daily life. The smallest habits carried weight. Hands were washed in a set way. Food was prepared with an eye to purity. Words were chosen carefully because truth itself was considered a force that either strengthened the fabric of creation or tugged at its threads until they frayed. A lie was never merely a personal fault, it was a wound to the world that someone else would have to heal. That is why instruction began early. Before a boy reached the age when he could stand in a training field, he learned to master his tongue. Speak plainly. Keep promises. Do not boast. The lesson was simple and strict, because an oath was not a decoration in speech. It was a doorway that let consequences through. When a promise was broken, the breach was real in the same way a shattered vessel was real, and the response had to be equally real. A ritual cleansing, a public correction, a cost paid, so that the damage did not spread from house to street, from street to city. Riding and archery rounded out the triad of virtues, not because war was an end in itself, but because control over the body mirrored control over the soul. A steady seat and a straight arrow trained breath, focus, and restraint, the same qualities demanded by the law when it called for patience in vengeance or silence in the face of insult. It was better to master a horse than to master an enemy. Better to hit a target at distance than to let anger loose at arm's length. Women lived inside this system with their own domains of strength. Household purity was not drudgery, it was stewardship of a sacred boundary. Managing water, tending the hearth, guarding grain from spoilage, these were not small tasks. They were a kind of priesthood in practice. A spoiled jar could sicken a family. An uncleaned vessel could carry impurity from meal to meal. In an order where food and flame belonged to the cosmic pattern, a woman's care made a household the first temple a child would ever know. Death, which tested that order more than any other event, called forth specialists, the corpse bearers. Their work was necessary and dangerous in the ritual sense, and so they lived by strict codes. They did not eat until they had cleansed. They did not enter homes without signs that announced their approach. They wore particular garments that could be washed and purified, and when cloth could no longer be trusted to release defilement, it was destroyed. None of this was theater. It was a map for keeping the world from drowning in what it could not digest. Because names carried weight, a change of name could be a sentence or a salvation. Some were stripped and shamed, bound to a label that announced guilt every time it was spoken. Others were given new names as a kind of rebirth after penance, a way to mark that the old disorder had been cut away and a different life had begun. This was not spin or ceremony for its own sake. It guided how neighbors would treat a person in the market, whether a judge would hear a case without prejudice, whether a priest would welcome someone back to the rites that stitched a community together. The court, for all its sternness, did not run on cruelty alone. Evidence mattered, testimony mattered, and memory mattered most of all. Witnesses were warned that a false account tugged not only at a case, but at the great balance itself. If someone lied, there were remedies. Public confession, restitution measured not just in coin, but in acts of service that returned dignity to those who had been harmed. In this way, justice did its work without wasting the human material that the state needed for fields, roads, and armies. Trade moved along roads that tied mountain to plain and river to sea, and every mile of road carried questions of purity. Caravans changed hands, goods changed carts, animals died along the way. The law adapted. There were rules for what to do if a beast fell where water might carry decay, if a cart overturned and spilled grain into a channel, if a merchant found a bundle of hair or a clipped nail in a bale of cloth. Do not panic. Do not spread the harm. Remove the danger. Cleanse what can be cleansed. Destroy what cannot. Pay for what was ruined, because the balance lived in fairness as much as it lived in fire and water. Festivals knit the calendar into a pattern that refreshed communities as surely as rain refreshed fields. The coming of spring was marked by cleansings, new garments, and the rekindling of hearth fires. Families gathered to eat sweet things and speak words that honored truth. Children learned by watching, the washing of hands in a certain order, the careful crossing of a threshold with a lamp held steady, the telling of stories that made the past present without turning it into a weapon. In times of rage, festivals could harden into vengeance. In times of sanity, they softened back into gratitude and restraint. Borders were more than lines on a map. A border was a liminal place where impurities could pass and where enemies could test courage without collapsing order. Garrison towns learned special disciplines. Latrines sat away from wells. Dead animals were dragged beyond dwelling lines to prevent creeping corruption. Patrols watched not only for raiders, but for practices that would drain a settlement's strength by fouling its own lifeblood. A commander who kept water clean might save more lives than one who won a skirmish. Mercy existed, but it wore a sober face. A first crime could be met with a sentence that taught rather than destroyed, a term of isolation to halt contagion, a public service to repay a hidden wound, a ritual overseen by priests to rebind a person to the law. The community had a stake in this because every person reclaimed was a field tended, a child taught, a gate watched. Mercy, then, was not indulgence. Mercy was investment. Not all customs travel well across centuries. Some practices recorded in later texts, especially those concerning kinship unions under narrow religious justifications, shock modern instincts. Even in their own time, such rites were rare and circled around elite circles that saw cosmic defense where others would see offense. To present them is not to praise them. It is to be honest about a civilization that tethered ethics to metaphysics so tightly that measures meant to guard a sacred order could harden into rules that later ages would rightly reject. The discipline of speech remained a constant. In markets, haggling had limits. A seller who lied about weight or purity did more than cheat a buyer. He fed disorder, and the law could treat his deceit as a pollutant that needed quick containment. Scales were inspected, measures were certified, penalties focused on restoring trust, a day with a placard that announced the offense, a levy that supported the poor, a donation of oil or grain to communal stores. Shame was used like salt, sparingly to preserve what mattered. Archives, especially in royal centers, guarded memory with care. Clay tablets and stone inscriptions were not merely records, they were anchors. When the state ordered an erasure, it was risky work, because cutting a name out of a line could loosen the whole record. Scribes learned to mend without lying, to mark a gap without closing it with invention, and to annotate why a text now bore a scar. In this way, the state balanced its urge to annihilate with its need to keep the past legible enough to guide the future. Armies marched with priests at their edges, not to bless slaughter, but to keep order from collapsing under the weight of fear and hunger. Fires were kept clean, water sources were guarded, spoils were counted, and, when necessary, destroyed rather than letting corruption ride home in wagons. Veterans learned to respect the laws of purity not because they were gentle souls, but because they had seen what happened when camps ignored them: sickness, panic, and a rot that no sword could cut. In cities, the king's face was rarely seen, and that distance was itself a tool. Awe enforced by ritual saved the state from becoming casual, because casual contact with power tempted casual betrayals. Audiences with the Shah were choreographed, eyes down, steps counted, words rehearsed so that nothing stray could slip into the moment and stain it. The same rules that kept a hearth clean kept a throne room intact. Education ended as it began, with truth. A boy who could ride and shoot but lied was not yet a man. A man who spoke truth but polluted water was not yet trustworthy. The goal was not perfection, it was balance, to hold courage and restraint, strength and mercy, piety and practicality in the same pair of hands without letting either side tip the scale. That was the art the Persians prized, and that is why their customs to a modern mind can seem both luminous and dark at once. Stories gathered at twilight, accounts of judges who held firm, of kings who failed and learned, of merchants who returned a coin rather than keep what was not theirs. These tales did more than pass the time. They trained the senses to notice where order thinned and where a word or a gesture could tighten the weave. To live inside such a culture was to feel the world as a fabric that one's own fingertips could mend or tear, one careful act at a time. There is a paradox at the heart of this civilization. The same system that guarded purity so fiercely also made space for repair. The law never promised a world without stain. It promised a way to meet stain without surrender. A spilled vessel could be cleaned. A broken oath could be mended through truth and recompense. Even exile, whether from a home, a market, or a shrine, could end when a person had paid the price the order demanded and learned to carry their own weight without tearing at the fabric that held everyone together. Priests and judges worked as twin pillars, but neither stood alone. Farmers who kept fields free of rot, artisans who refused to thin oil with water, herdsmen who protected temple animals from harm. Each performed a kind of liturgy in daily life. The point was not a flawless surface. The point was resilience, a society taught to notice danger early, respond swiftly, and keep moving without letting catastrophe define what came next. That is why cleanliness mattered as much to an army camp as to a bakery, why a merchant's honesty mattered as much as a magistrate's verdict. Some rites carried a severity that later ages would not accept. Sanctioned kinship unions under strict theological logic, punishments that preserved the elements by sacrificing comfort or speed, erasures that treated a name as if it were a second body. These are hard to face, yet they reveal a logic that never lost sight of the stakes. If names tethered souls to judgment across the bridge of account, then to foul a name was to endanger more than reputation. If blood belonged to the sacred weave, then to spill it without necessity was to pick at the cords that kept wind, fire, soil, and river in their places. One may reject the methods and still see the fear they were meant to master. The household returned always to the center of this world. Mourning began with small acts that taught children to prize order without choking joy. A lamp trimmed before dawn, hands washed in a set rhythm, kindling laid with patience so that flame rose clean. Meals followed patterns that turned hunger into gratitude. Even laughter had boundaries, not to stifle it, but to keep it from curdling into mockery that could loosen respect. The domestic sphere was where grand principles learned to sit in a chair, pass bread, and listen. Trade and tribute moved like blood through the empire's veins. Caravans carried spices, fabrics, worked metal, and bright stones across distances that could swallow a life. Along the way, law rode in the open, markers set to direct waste away from streams, stations where water could be drawn and guarded, inspectors who knew that a tainted bale could sicken a city. The discipline that kept a village well clean also kept a 1,000-mile road from turning into a chain of slow disasters. Long memories could be dangerous, so the culture taught a craft of remembering that did not always end in revenge. Festivals that had once hardened into days of wrath could be softened, their edges filed down by teachers who retold the stories with an emphasis on warning rather than license. Children learned that to remember was to choose which seed to water. The past offered examples, not permissions. The line between those two was guarded as carefully as any city gate. Kingship played its part without swallowing the whole. The Shah embodied order, yet order outlived any one body. Even when a king died, the rites that kept his face veiled and his name unspoken for a span were less about awe than about continuity. Time given for officers to settle ranks, for priests to cleanse spaces, for the state to breathe without gasping. Distance preserved more than dignity. It preserved stability. Power that stayed rare in sight stayed lighter on the street, and that lightness helped households go on baking bread while palaces changed hands. Frontier life trained clarity. Families who woke to dust and watchfires learned the hierarchy of needs. Keep water fit, keep animals healthy, keep tempers cool, keep knives clean. A drunk soldier was more dangerous than an enemy at the wall because he could foul both water and trust in the same night. So discipline sharpened where the land thinned, and officers who understood purity codes could keep a garrison alive through seasons that would have broken softer towns. In the courts, proportion remained a compass even when tempers ran hot. A first theft did not call for an ending. It called for a binding, work set to repay loss, instruction set to repair character, confession spoken so that the wound in trust could start to close. Only when a person refused every bridge back did the law narrow to penalties that isolated harm rather than letting it run through families like a fever. This was public health for the moral body, as deliberate as any campaign against plague. The erasure of names, for all its terror, also carried a warning for rulers. To order an annihilation of record was to admit a failure of patience, to choose fear over the slower labor of persuasion and reform. Scribes, who knew what scars meant on clay and stone, learned to leave signs that a gap existed, notes that whispered to the future, "Something was cut here. Be careful." In that way, even the state's hardest fist could not fully silence its own historians. The record bent, but it did not break. Truth in the end was the thread that held all of this together. Not truth as a weapon, but truth as a craft. A child learned to say what happened without embroidery. A trader learned to weigh without shaving the measure. A commander learned to report losses without hiding bodies behind boasts. A priest learned to admit when a rite had been botched and to begin again. A judge learned to say, "Enough," when punishment stopped healing and started satisfying appetites that the law was never designed to feed. To live inside such a system was to feel the world press back, not cruelly, but firmly, whenever a hand strayed. That pressure taught grace. People learned to pause before speaking, to clean a spill before explaining it, to ask whether an action would leave water worse than they found it, whether a joke would turn the air bitter in a room that needed harmony more than mirth. The result was not a utopia. It was a culture that knew how to keep going. Twilight returned, as it always did, and with it the stories that gave edges to the day. Tales of kings who learned to bow to law, of judges who cut bribes out of their own flesh, of families who chose compensation over vengeance because they wanted their children to inherit fields, not feuds. Tales of errors that were owned, of rivers that were cleansed before sickness found a foothold, of markets that punished deceit with remedies instead of ruin. Each story was a tool placed in a young hand with the instruction to use it when the world began to tilt. And so the legend of ancient Persia took shape. Not only palaces, not only battles, not only punishments that tested the limits of human endurance, but an everyday discipline that made it possible for millions to eat, trade, and pray without tripping over one another's shadows. The grandeur that dazzled travelers was real, but it was built from habits as small as washing a bowl the right way and speaking a hard truth without delay. In a universe governed by a law of balance, those humble acts were the bricks that held up the arches. If there is a lesson to carry forward, it is this: purity is not sterility, order is not rigidity, and mercy is not softness. Purity protects what feeds life. Order arranges strength so that it serves rather than devours. Mercy invests in returns that cannot be counted in coin. When those three work together, when a household guards its water, a merchant guards his scale, a magistrate guards the line between justice and spectacle, the world becomes durable enough to endure storms without losing its shape. The Persians, rising from scattered tribes to a power that bent horizons, did not succeed because they feared darkness more than others. They succeeded because they trained themselves to keep lamps trimmed, because they believed that truth, spoken plainly and lived stubbornly, could hold chaos at bay. In that belief, they found a dignity that outlasted kings and a culture that still compels attention. Severe, intricate, at times unbearably hard, yet lit from within by an unyielding desire to keep the elements clean and the human bond unbroken.